much looking forward to that. And we will also host our quarterly ethics forum, of which tonight's event is an iteration. I want to thank our staff, Amber Bautista and Madden Westland. They help bring these events together and bring them to you. As for a land acknowledgement, here at the University of California, Santa Barbara, the campus is on the traditional lands of the Chumash peoples, the unceded lands and waters of Chumash peoples, who are, of course, still with us. The university's relationship with Chumash peoples has not always been positive. Many of us here on campus are working to change that relationship and working with Chumash communities to that end. So we'll look forward to better days, and please reach out if you think there are things we could be doing differently on those fronts. In terms of tonight's events, an outline. After introductions, Professor Sideris and I will engage in a brief conversation. Then she will share with us several readings from her recent work. After that, I'll ask Greg Jarrett, a member of the CAPS Center, to join us, and he will ask Professor Sideris a series of questions about her work and of particular relevance to his students in his forum class. Then I will rejoin the conversation to field audience Q&A. So we please invite you along the way to post your questions in the Q&A and keep them short and crisp if you can. And those are much more easily handled than large dissertations. So resist that impulse when possible. Now I'd like to welcome Lisa Sideris and Professor Fabio Rambelli, Chair of the Department of Religious Studies, to the screen to join me. Welcome, thank you both for being here. So Fabio Rambelli, after I introduce Professor Sideris, is going to offer just his words of welcome on behalf of the department. Lisa Sideris is professor in the Environmental Studies program here at UCSB and an affiliate member of the Department of Religious Studies. Before coming to UCSB, she taught in the Religious Studies department at Indiana University, also her alma mater, the Faculty of Religious Studies and the School of Environment at McGill University in Montreal, and the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Pace University in New York City. She is author of Environmental Ethics, Ecological Theology, and Natural Selection, and more recently of Consecrating Science, Wonder, Knowledge, and the Natural World, and also co-editor of a collection of interdisciplinary essays on the life and work of environmental pioneer Rachel Carson, titled Rachel Carson, Legacy and Challenge. Her research focuses broadly on the ethical significance of natural processes and the way in which environmental values are captured or obscured by narratives and perspectives from religion and the sciences. Her recent research examines the role of wonder in contemporary scientific discourse and its impact on how humans conceive of and relate to nature. She is especially interested in the mythic, religious, and ethical dimensions of the so-called Anthropocene and its attendant technologies, such as geoengineering and de-extinction. The overarching question that drives her research is how to articulate a vision of the human that is appropriate to the environmental challenges we collectively face. She is actively involved in a number of international research initiatives in the environmental humanities and serves as president-elect of the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. A great entity, I should add, with a wonderful journal. Please check it out. So I welcome Fabio Rambelli, Chair of the Department of Religious Studies. Welcome.
Thank you, Greg, and good evening to everyone. Very much appreciate that you are joining us today here, for this important event of the CAP Center. I have the distinctive pleasure and the honor to welcome Professor Lisa Sideris to this event here tonight. As Professor Johnson has said, she joined our university, UCSB, this summer. And we are all very happy that she's here with us. She will bring an enormous contribution to campus. And I should also say to our Department of Religious Studies, Professor Sideris is a new affiliate to the department, and we are very proud and very happy that she joined us like really a few weeks ago. And I think that this is the first public event that she's doing, not only for the CAP Center, but also for the, indirectly for the Department of Religious Studies. So I'm very happy to welcome Lisa here to this event tonight. And I really wish that we were live, in person. And I hope that we can do that again sooner. So without further ado, this is my, brief words of greetings. And again, welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Rambelli.
Thank you.
Professor Sideris, it's so great to have you here. We've been eagerly anticipating your arrival, and here you are, even if you're not yet settled in your office. We know these things take time. Professor Sideris and I have come to UCSB about the same time. I came just a bit earlier, so it's been fun to be in conversation about what does it mean to make such a transition professionally and otherwise. But your transition involves one across disciplines as well. I mean, disciplines you've been involved with for much time, but I'd like to lead off the conversation by asking you about this shift to environmental studies. I should add, not away from religious studies, we'll keep a hold on you over here, but to an institutional home in environmental studies here. Well, what are you imagining by way of shifts in methodology, possible collaborators, audience reception of your work? Where do you see new horizons here? And also, if you might say a word about, in general, about the relationship of environmental studies to religious studies, and where you see provocative work being done. I'm not hearing her. Could someone else tell me if...
I can't hear her either.
Okay, so we can't hear you.
I just unmuted myself.
Oh, now,
again.
okay.
Okay, it was unmuted, but I don't know. I'm having a little bit of trouble with this laptop.
With
so
us
anyway.
now.
Thank you very much for the welcome, both of you. And I know, yeah, Greg, you also experienced what it's like to move to a new place during the pandemic. So it's really nice to have people helping to introduce me to the university, since we're still in a little bit of that COVID weirdness where people are together a little bit, but really not quite together in the way that we used to be. So, so environmental studies, I guess moving to an environmental studies program is it's more like a shift in emphasis, I guess, than a big change. I mean, in my career as a whole, the places that you mentioned that I have worked at, I began in a philosophy and religious studies program many years ago. Then I was jointly appointed in environmental studies and religious studies when I was at McGill, so I had appointments in each of these. Then I went to just a single appointment in religious studies at Indiana University, and now I'm sort of switching to, FTE and environmental studies with some affiliate status. But I think it's more, so I've sort of been trying to sort of get at the same thing from different angles, I guess, and feel like that it's just a slight sort of shift in emphasis, perhaps. But I think one of the really wonderful things about the environmental studies program here is that there's so much going on at UCSB already. There's so many initiatives in the environmental humanities, in especially environmental justice initiatives, with more of those on the way. So maybe a larger audience, or maybe even just the chance to sort of speak in more than one register to both, religious studies students and audiences in environmental studies. So there's more of a framework kind of built into this program for me to reach that broader audience, and that's something that I'm really excited about in my teaching. In terms of, methodology, I think there's something about religious studies and environmental studies that they have in common, and that both of them are kind of, it's very hard to say what makes them a discipline. And of course, there's always internal discussions in religious studies, and traditionally have been in environmental studies as well, about, what is this thing? and where are the boundaries? And I think for someone like me, especially who's coming from an ethics background, it's very easy to kind of move across those two things, environmental ethics, religious ethics. So it's more of a kind of opening things up a little bit to be able to talk to different students and different colleagues. And in particular, I think for someone like me whose interest is in science and religion and the environment, that means that I also get to have dialogues with, that are built in my own unit, with scientists who most of us, in the humanities we don't often get to talk to scientists, just in a day-to-day basis. And it's very enlightening just to hear about the kinds of things that environmental scientists are doing, but also I find it super valuable just to be able to kind of sometimes fact check myself when I'm writing about, a scientific concept or, something that I'm just kind of a little bit familiar with, to be able to say, do I have this right? Am I committing any sort of major faux pas here when I'm speaking in this way about, whatever it is, Darwinism or ecosystems or something like that. So just having that kind of built-in interdisciplinarity, I think environmental studies takes that to sort of another level.
Oh, this all makes perfect sense to me. And then two other considerations, it seems, of course, you'll be over adjacent or even within the Bren School in terms of colleagues. And I happened to speak to a class there yesterday, and it really struck me the kind of policy orientation of the students, and to be part of that conversation, for better or for worse, right? Policy goes lots of directions, but to be an active shaper of that dialogue about how students think about policy initiatives strikes me as an opportunity. And then on another front, welcome to California, as we're both discovering, fires, droughts, whatnot, that there's no shortage of things to think with and about.
That is one of the things that I thought a lot about, was there's something about being in this state where you can't really dodge the reality of climate change. Of course, people try, and people try to do that everywhere. And, my own hometown, Bloomington, while I was here looking for a house this summer, flooded so severely that parts of the downtown were underwater. These kinds of things are happening everywhere. But I think being here, it's really front and center. And there was, I guess, a part of me that wanted to be kind of in a position where I'm dealing with these things more directly, and with other people who are also dealing with them directly, if in a very different way, that this is a reality that we're confronting together. And I think there's a real comfort in that, in being around people who share that sense of priorities.
Sure. No, that rings true. Absolutely. Well, let's see where things go, no doubt. Also, a part of being in California is the presence of a phrase you coined is techno-optimism. That's all around us here in California. This is a framework you use in some of your recent work, and I think as a way of introducing some of the readings you're about to share with us. Could you say just a little bit about techno-optimism and its perhaps American exceptionalist qualities that are on full display in a place like California?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a way in which American exceptionalism and human exceptionalism and kind of California exceptionalism sort of dovetail, or that California's techno-optimism is a kind of, it's sort of American exceptionalism on steroids or something. And so what I mean by that is that, there's what some people, there are media scholars in like the mid-90s who use this phrase of the Californian ideology, which is, there's this particular confluence of things in California of on the one hand, a kind of bohemian, hippies, quote unquote, counterculture. And then, just the, technophilia, techno-determinism, sort of a do-it-yourself kind of culture, which, really came together, of course, in the 1960s, but has sort of continued in this way, that California has this particular kind of optimism that's very very bound up with technology and individual expression and a kind of orientation towards the future. And in some cases, and this is not an indictment of California as a whole, but in some cases, I think this sort of techno-optimism is a sort of pessimism about the possibility of real social change. So in some ways, technology sort of stands in for, it's a way of making us infinitely adaptable so that we don't have to change in fundamental ways, or of adapting the world to us rather than sort of fitting ourselves into the natural world. And that's something that's really struck me about some of the, what I call sort of Anthropocene ethics, that is sort of ethical, global ethical issues that are being addressed primarily as technological problems or problems that admit of a technological solution. So things like species extinction, that the idea is we can just bring them back, when species go extinct, we can use these cutting edge, genetic editing technologies to bring them back, geoengineering, things like that. What some of these technologies have in common, I think, is that they begin from kind of that 60s moment of technology meets the counterculture. When you think of something like the whole Earth image, the first time the Earth was seen from space, which is kind of my own point of departure for thinking about some of the work that I've been doing. That image of the Earth from space sort of culminates in our idea of the Anthropocene as this thing that is an object that can be manipulated by humans, or that humans can sort of rearrange the parts or recreate it in some way. And so, on the one hand, that image is a symbol of the environmental movement. I mean, it was, in the first Earth Day rallies and things like that, you see this sort of love your Mother Earth thing. So you've got this kind of attachment to Earth, even this sort of feeling of love and care and stewardship, but the sort of detachment at the same time, that this has become an object to be manipulated by humans. And so if the Anthropocene is the moment where humans sort of begin to understand themselves as being in relation to this thing as an object that we can remake in some way, then it sort of begins in that strange sort of confluence, which is, if not uniquely Californian, I think has its origins in California. And you see it also in things like, the work of Elon Musk, or that we're all now sort of trapped in these worlds that we're not making ourselves. And we have the sense of not having agency over those worlds. And yet at that very same moment, somehow the human is supposed to be in control of everything. So those are some of the questions that interest me.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this rings so true. And it's what you say about techno-optimism, framing it that way is such a nice segue to me inviting you to share some readings. And as you know, I've been struck as I've read your recent work, the way you marshal certain dispositional categories, especially wonder, grief, and hope. And you've selected a few passages from your work to speak to those categories. I invite you to share with us a bit.
Well, so the first one is about wonder, I guess, and maybe I should give a little bit of background, the way that I think about wonder. And this is from my book that you mentioned, Consecrating Science, which came out in 2017. One of the things that I was trying to do with that book is to think about what are the sort of proper and improper objects of wonder, sort of when is wonder a good thing and when is it a bad thing? Because people, I think, tend to think of wonder as being sort of obviously or self-evidently good, like we encourage children to experience it. Scientists tell us that we should experience it. The world would be a better place if everyone has a sense of wonder. But, it's often the question that's not asked is sort of wonder what exactly? What are the objects of wonder? What are the forms of wonder? Yeah. And so this kind of techno-optimism, as I see it, is actually a kind of wonder at ourselves and what we're able to do as this kind of world-making creature. So wonder it carries a lot of dispositions with it, which can be sort of moral or morally suspect, I guess. And so I was trying to think about the way that the form that wonder takes when it's oriented towards science in particular, as opposed to the natural world, which is also an object of science, and how those things can sometimes come into competition. So this is an excerpt from an introductory chapter of Consecrating Science. Whether or not wonder leads us astray depends very much on the objects toward which it is oriented and the dispositions and attitudes that it engenders. Wonder's proper objects, and especially its attendant dispositions and attitudes, are what interest me. The natural world, I believe, is a worthy object of wonder in reality in a way that science, which is a human enterprise, is not. Celebrations of the human enterprise of science become a liability when they gravitate towards myths and motifs of hubristic trespass or forbidden knowledge. Popular purveyors of scientific wonder often embrace myths not as cautionary tales against overweening pride and reckless curiosity, but as justifications for intrepid pursuit of knowledge and the eradication of mysteries. And so biologist E.O. Wilson, who's someone who's featured in my book, says this: let us see how high we can fly before the sun melts the wax in our wings. But this is not the sort of dictum that we should heed if it is nature, not merely ourselves, that we cherish and hold within our wondering gaze. In order to reclaim some of what has been lost through these diminished accounts of wonder, I turn to the insights of Rachel Carson, whose life and work carries on an older tradition of nature study. As the Anthropocene lens zooms out to take in the largest possible picture of our species, our planet, deep time, and the cosmos, the reigning assumption seems to be that our stories must also scale up dramatically. The idea seems to be that we require sweeping grand narratives that will embolden us to tackle global scale environmental challenges and reassure us that we have not lost control, that our story remains one of progress and upward ascent. In Consilience, E.O. Wilson offers one such image of ascent: Icarus flying to the sun, his wax wings melting, but his heart beating with wild exultation at his own reckless daring, his brief proximity to the gods. Icarus, a tragic figure, maybe more apt than Wilson knows. For perhaps we have now seen how high we can fly. We have encountered our limits. The melting has begun. So maybe now is a good time to return to the earth and to our senses. Here, before it's too late, we can join Rachel Carson in wondering at the miniature universe of a tide pool or the mystery of a growing seed. We might learn to scale back our ambitions, to cherish what is small and modest, and to tell many stories in many voices from many different places. Perhaps we can rediscover our humanity.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Now, that calls to mind so many moments. People who do ethnographic work like I do, who end up working in communities and seeing how communities struggle with issues, gain an ear for the kinds of things you're talking about. Absolutely. In terms of the scientific wonder side, of course, there's the 30-meter telescope and all the astronomic promise it might offer. But it's a kind of wonder, as you're talking about, that eclipses some aspects of humanity, namely the humanity of people on that very same mountain who have other different and more enduring claims to it. When I was in the protest camps, to see how people conducted themselves in what they regard as a sacred space, even to the point of the micro, you're talking about the small instances. There was a group of folks who were replanting the forest there, just taking seedlings out from the camp of trees and planting them. And that micro gesture of nurturance for that landscape struck me as wonderful in a way a telescope never could be, to try to shift the idiom. So anyhow, I appreciate the resonances for sure. And I'm quite sure that's true of our audience's reception as well.
And I think some of these stories that claim that, humanity as the sort of, the good that's being advanced by this progressive narrative has a very particular idea of who the human is, and often, at the exclusion of other humans and of course non-humans as well. So it's kind of these very big, sweeping, progressive stories that I worry about and I wonder about their efficacy really as the kinds of stories that can motivate people you know, on that kind of back to earth level. Like it's fun to watch these, you know, rockets go into space, but why are we doing that? You know, it's wondrous, but
Yeah.
why? Why are we doing it? Why at this moment is that an important thing to be doing?
Yeah. Well, perhaps on that note, you could share what you've written about hope for us. And then after you share that, I think I'll cede to Greg Jarrett so he could ask you some questions.
Well, there's a piece that I chose from, it's an essay called Biophony. There's also one on grief, so I don't know which one you would rather I focus on. Maybe hope would be a little bit better, but it's only about hope in a kind of implicit way, I think. But this was an essay that I wrote when I was teaching a class on extinction. So the whole course was on extinction,
Yeah.
all different kinds of extinction, and one of the forms.
Lisa, your sound, okay, now it's come back. Your sound had faded out there. Okay, sorry.
I was just saying the extinction of sound, and my sound went out. So, you know, being able to actually hear extinction through sounds in nature that are disappearing. So soundscape ecology. And, you know, this moment during the pandemic when everyone was in lockdown in particular, you know, we could hear these things that we couldn't hear before, and people began paying attention to the natural world and bird song and all of these things. So this is an essay that I wrote sort of thinking about reconnecting with nature, I guess, through the senses and through sound in particular. And I wrote it in part for my students in that extinction class. So in spring 2020, when the virus shut down my college campus, abruptly sending courses online and students scurrying home, I was teaching a class on the topic of extinction. Like many courses I teach in environmental issues, the material seemed sadly opposite in light of current events. For me, one of the most compelling topics on a course syllabus suffused with dark portent was material from Bernie Krause, an ecologist and one-time studio musician who spent decades recording natural soundscapes. He actually did the film credits for Apocalypse Now, the helicopter sounds that are in that film, something that he recorded. Apocalypse stalks him and he it. Krause estimates that more than half of the natural soundscapes that he has recorded have now fallen silent, as habitat destruction and a warming climate have wreaked havoc on birds, insects, and amphibians. For those like Krause who are trained to listen to soundscapes, climate change and its reshuffling of biotic systems can actually be heard in nature's shifting orchestral patterns. Some species are audibly abundant when they shouldn't be. Other voices are arriving earlier or later than usual due to climate change, and some are missing from the symphony altogether. Rehearsing the details of soundscape extinction with my students in that spring 2020 might have been a dispiriting exercise in a course on an alarming subject in the midst of a rampaging virus. But the conversation took an oddly uplifting turn. My students, most of whom were now joining class discussion from their homes via Zoom technology, from far-flung parts of the US, Texas, New York, Chicago, Minnesota, had their own stories to tell about the sudden liveliness of the particular landscapes and soundscapes that they call home. The pandemic's calming of human activity had foregrounded the sounds of the non-human world, what ecologists call biophony, in ways that were now apparent to all of us. So we compared notes about what we were seeing and hearing or learning to hear again in the outside world. And in the general slowing down of life's pace, some students reported a growing attunement to a full spectrum of sounds, both indoor and outdoor, human and non-human, an awakening of their animal senses to the creaking of stairs or the hum of a refrigerator. Isolated at home for long hours with parents and siblings, they were relearning how to distinguish the footfalls of different family members. When I was a kid staying up late, one student told us, I had to learn to tell my sister's footsteps from my mom's so that I wouldn't get in trouble. I relayed to them the discovery that I recently made while conducting my entire life from a tiny home office at the top of the stairs, namely that my teenage son whistles absentmindedly throughout the day, a trait he shares with his father. Cultural ecologist David Abram reminds us that humans possess deeply ingrained, if largely forgotten, senses. Those who work to preserve what remains of the natural world, Abram writes, quote, must work as well for a return to our senses, for a renewed respect for sensorial modes of knowing, end quote. The pandemic has made this work a little easier through the gift of cross-species listening and watching. In the wake of the unasked for silencing of the human world and in nature's unexpected sights and sounds, we can read signs not just of warning, but also of comfort and hope.
Thank you. Well, yes, hope, no doubt. I can't pretend to add anything by way of wisdom to follow on that. So I'll just thank you for sharing. It may be the case that towards the end, if we have time for the third reading, we'll return to that. But I think for now, in the interest of time, to get Greg Jarrett involved in the conversation would be fantastic, to ask you some questions about your work. Greg works in ethics and bioethics in particular at times, and teaches on the subject, and is a better informed question asker than I. So Greg, please join us. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson.
Sure.
Yeah, well, thank you, Lisa, for appearing with us. This is just wonderful. I actually was looking forward to the third reading about grief. I know that you have said that, maybe in response to the ethics of de-extinction, that, there's something appropriate about grief. And very often in professionals, psychologists, philosophers, they have this neat distinction between negative emotions and positive emotions that never made any sense to me at all. It's rarely defined. Like, anger is supposed to be a negative emotion. It's like, well, if that means it feels bad, well, anger often feels good, right? And if it means dysfunctional, well, any emotion can be dysfunctional. And, and if it means it represents something negative, well, that's something very different. But presumably, most of these people would call grief a negative emotion, right? I'm not sure if I share that, but how does your views on grief or eco-grief, and perhaps if it connects up to eco-extinction, what do you have to say about that?
I mean, that's a great question, and it actually goes right back to this kind of blending of techno-optimism and a kind of detachment from nature with a at least ostensibly a rationale of getting closer to nature in some way. So, I mean, de-extinction is often seen as like a good news story. Like the public wants to hear these stories, like because there's so much bad news. Environmental news is, the headlines are always bad. So you tell people a good story about how we can bring these things back, that gets people excited. And the assumption is that facing the future should always be, the sort of optimistic orientation, that if we look back, if we look behind us, there are many, many myths about the dangers of looking back. And grief, is then associated with this kind of paralysis or something of looking back, where what you need to do is just move on, keep moving on, don't look back. And in fact, Stuart Brand, who's one of the figures who I think embodies this kind of techno-optimism and a certain kind of techno-environmentalism, says, don't grieve, organize, right? So let's marshal all of our technology to recreate extinct species so that we don't have to grieve, we don't have to wallow in this grief. And so it's a critique of environmentalists for wallowing in grief. But there's no way that things can really change if what we want to do is not just fix things around the edges, but actually put a stop to things like extinction, unless people grieve, because grief is defined by many people who've done much more research on this topic than I have, as it's a way of trying to adapt to a world that has radically changed. And it's a process that's important for understanding why people value things, right? When we grieve over something, it's an acknowledgement that something of value has been lost. So if grief is about adjusting ourselves to a radically changed reality, de-extinction is about sort of denying that reality and adapting the world up so we don't have to actually change.
Wow, thank you.
So that the work, people talk about grief doing work, and the part of the work that it does is on us, as opposed to just the world around us, fixing the world around us rather than sort of working on ourselves.
Yeah, so if my mother dies, you know, it's not really dysfunctional that I grieve, right?
It would
So
be dysfunctional if you didn't.
yeah, right, exactly. It would be dysfunctional if I didn't. Yes. You work, or you're part of the Rachel Carson Center, and you seem to have done more work on Rachel Carson than Rachel Carson has done. You know, my mother was very inspired in the 60s by Rachel Carson in a way that I didn't quite understand until later. She essentially transformed from being a Mormon into being a hippie. I'm not sure quite how to explain that, but you know, many of us and my students should be able to give you, you know, at least 6 sentences about Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and you know, how that captured the attention of kind of fueled the modern version of the American environmental movement, along with later things like Santa Barbara oil spills and you know, rivers are not supposed to catch on fire, right? That's not natural. You know, all these things sort of came together. And I guess there was, you know, tremendous backlash at Rachel Carson. But also she's, you know, she's credited with at least starting to take down, you know, the gods of government, technology, and business, which during World War II were like really great things, you know. But you know, beyond that, I really don't, you know that much. I mean, what does what do we not know? You know, those of us who haven't studied it about Rachel Carson, and does she perhaps have something to say for the ethics of the new generation, of the climate generation?
Yeah, well, I think what Carson was doing at this moment, so, you know, the early 60s, a lot of her writing prior to that was on the oceans. You know, all of her first 3 books were about the sea. So Silent Spring was actually a departure in that it was directly targeting an environmental problem. I mean, it was an unpleasant topic that she didn't really want to write about, but felt compelled to do that. Someone had to do it, you know. And I think one of the things that she foresaw that is very relevant today was this sort of moment, sort of like this whole Earth moment when, you know, we first began to understand the Earth as this object. But for her, it was the launch of Sputnik. And she has this really remarkable letter that she wrote to her closest friend when Sputnik was launched, and how this was sort of the beginning of humans beginning to you know, sort of master space as well as Earth, without ever kind of mastering ourselves in the first place. You know, she says the main challenge is not mastery of the world, but mastery of ourselves. And so we're at this kind of immature moment, you know, as a species, if you want to think of it that way, when we have this technology that can do all of these things that we're not really mature enough to know how to handle. And for her, that was, I think, partly what she was predicting, was that we might become so enchanted with our own technological prowess that it would begin to eclipse other kind of more wholesome forms of enchantment, like, you know, wonder at the natural world itself. So I think that's still really relevant. But, you know, one of the things I love about Carson, she's a fantastic writer, of course. Everyone, you know, everyone mentions that about her work, but she does something else, which is that there's a very egalitarian and sort of democratic tone to the way that she writes. It's very anti-authoritarian. You know, it's not you know, at a time when we have all these books that sort of tell us who the human being is, here's who we are, we're the creature that does X, you know, there's a lot of things like that, especially I think right now, books that are doing that. She has a way of kind of engaging with the reader that says, you know, you're a smart and intelligent person with good instincts, you know, I don't need to tell you what to do, but here's what we know and here's what we don't know. And you make up your mind. And I trust you. I trust you as an intelligent reader. And there's something just very respectful about the way that she engages her audience that is very endearing and very compelling as a writer.
Good. Thank you. You know, moving forward, you know, into the next generation, you know, we're going to need, you know, really sound policy decisions and all this stuff they're talking about in environmental studies and whatnot. And I mean, nobody denies that we need, you know, good policy. However, there is, you know, quite a dispute, even in your Department of Religious Study, I mean, of Environmental Studies, you know, about the role of, you know, personal action or lifestyle or virtue. That, you know, on the one hand, we want to say, well, we want to do what we can, and we, you know, it might be small, but it's a low-lying fruit, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, many people think that, you know, this is just sort of feel-good stuff, you know, that, you know, it makes me feel nice to, you know, whatever, cut back on something or even, you know, buy an electric car or something like that. You know, or, you know, I guess there's a third option that our lifestyle changes will really be a function of you know, policy decisions that we make, or just the inevitable. But how do you fall on this sort of debate about whether my personal lifestyle, you know, that I should take it seriously, especially in the light of climate change as being, you know, such a huge and global issue, and I'm so very, very, very tiny.
Well, yeah, climate change is obviously the one that seems the most abstract and impossible to address from sort of individual level. But, you know, I don't think it has to be sort of one or the other. I mean, I think that the problem is that, you know, when we find something like, you know, Exxon telling like, here's 10 things you can do to lighten your carbon footprint. Well, you know, what they're doing is sort of offloading the responsibility for some kind of, you know, systemic change onto individuals who, you know, really are not the bulk of, you know, the sources of emissions. I mean, more so in this country than in some places, but, you know, the problems have to be addressed at some systemic level. And so I think we should be suspicious when we see corporations sort of telling us how we can, you know, save the planet by driving less or saving water or doing any of those things. But on the other hand, you know, and you know this, someone who studied ethics, you know, the virtue ethics tradition, other kinds of traditions. I mean, I think there's an intuition that people have that our values and our actions should be integrated in some way. And so that's why we critique, you know, Al Gore for how many square feet of there is in his house, or how many, you know, how much he flies, or young people are saying, who's Al Gore? I mean, you know, who that is, but maybe people remember Al Gore. And I think that intuition that people should live their values, you know, and walk the walk is the right intuition. So there is something to be said for that. The problem is that it becomes this kind of almost like the equivalent of sort of a personal carbon offsetting or something, where every time, you know, it's like, oh, it's okay for me to drive my car because, you know, I only have one child. So, you know, look, I'm not using as much carbon as some people. Or, you know, when I take a shower, I take a a bucket in the shower with me so I can collect the water that's, until the water gets hot, right? Because my shower takes a long time to get hot. I take that water, I water my plants with it. I mean, I'm not going to save the planet doing that. I'm not even going to make a dent in Santa Barbara's drought situation, but there's no reason not to do that. And it feels like the right thing to do. So I think, the problem is that if people become too immersed in kind of calculating their impact, and I think other scholars who study this would agree. I'm thinking of Sarah McFarlane Taylor's work in particular, who's written this book called Eco-Piety, where she addresses this problem. The problem is that it diverts our attention and our energy away from other things that we could be doing, like political engagement or activism, and we need people to kind of save their energy for those kinds of things.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask you, I think, a really tough question. It's a tough question because I don't know how to answer it, but that's what we're here for. Before the pandemic, a few years ago, I've been sort of teaching environmental ethics on and off since 2005, I'd say. And, it's always been interesting and fun. But I noticed just a distinct change, about 4 years ago, in the tone of undergraduate students. That things like climate change were no longer, something to be debated or something to be concerned about or something like that, as they sort of transitioned into a kind of climate anxiety. And I know we were starting to talk about this the other day, that I've had students just coming up to me like I'm some sort of expert, asking, should I have a child? In my generation, we asked that question because we thought about the impact of, an American child, et cetera, which is pretty significant. But now they're asking it from the point of view of their child, should I have a child? That's a lot of climate anxiety. And maybe some of it is driven by the way we teach this stuff. Well, a lot of it, I'm sure, is. So that's part of the question. But are we teaching this the wrong way? But the really tough question is, is what kind of advice to give these students? I mean, very often what I say, and I really don't have any evidence for this, is that immersing yourself in the problem or in the solutions, really helps. And you don't have to save the whole world, right? You get a job in law or teaching or whatever you're doing and immerse yourself. But I don't have any evidence that really helps. What's your take on this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I do get this question, maybe not so much in the form of should I have children, but just sort of, how do you have hope for the future? That's the question I get. And I think, I think when a student, anyone, but when a young person asks you a question like that, it's important to take it seriously and to think about what you're going to say, because it's a moment where you could have such an impact on somebody's life that it's actually a little frightening to find yourself in that moment. And what I often say about hope, and I think you're getting at this when you talk about working on solving problems together, is that hope is something that it's not something out there, that it's something people create, and you also have to think, people create it together, people doing things together, working on the same problems together, create a sense of hope and a sense of agency. And I think a lot of what many of us are feeling, because our lives are so dominated by technologies and other kinds of cultural forces that we feel like we don't have control over anymore, that asserting your agency in that way by choosing to work on a problem gives you a sense of hope. and this is, from the bit that I didn't read, but some of this comes for me from Rebecca Solnit's work, her work, Hope in the Dark, I found really useful to think about. She says that people mistakenly think that hope is this entirely future-oriented thing, but hope actually comes from our grounding in the past. And she takes this from a theologian, Walter Brueggemann, who says that, in the same way that amnesia produces despair, memory produces hope, because when we remember what happened in the past, we remember how surprised we were when things took certain twists and turns. That things don't just unfold in this unpredictable way, because history is not linear, life isn't linear. And it's in those sort of unexpected moments that there's possibilities for things to change, and that people make them change. It's not inevitable. So there are all kinds of futures that are still open to us at this point, precisely because we don't know how the story ends. And I think there's a lot of hope to be found in that, particularly because it gives hope back to the people and not to these big stories that we tell about who we are, as if we're just, kind of passively pulled along by the story, but we actually make the story happen.
Right. Thank you. I think this will be my last question before turning it, unless Greg wants to take it over, because we would actually like to hear that passage about grief.
What I was going to suggest is this. I'm very much enjoying your conversation. We have about 8 minutes till the hour. So I'm going to suggest that our viewers, and there are many of you, 80 plus, and this is really wonderful at this time in the quarter to see this kind of uptake. By the way, it's being recorded. You can find it on our website later if you want to pass on the good word. But you viewers, be posting your questions in the Q&A as Greg and Professor Sideris engage in one more question. Then at about the top of the hour, I'll chime back in. We'll take the few questions we have and see if any more come along, and then we'll call it a good night.
Great. Okay. And yeah, I hope we do have time to hear more about grief. That really interests me tremendously. So this might be a quick question, and we've already talked about your take on the ethics of de-extinction, but I remember in some of your writing, you describe it as cruel, or at least sometimes as being cruel, and maybe you could just briefly expand on what you mean by that.
Extinction technologies as being cruel. So what you're asking?
Yeah.
Well, and I think also just the kind of work that goes on at the edges of extinction, which is a term that Tom Van Doren, environmental scholar, environmental humanities scholar, says. Yeah, so I mean, it's the things that that organisms are put through to try to save the last, members of the species, or the what he calls the sort of like the ragged edge of species extinction. When you look at the kind of manipulation of animals' lives and even their bodies, to try to keep the species going at any cost. So that, you've got this concept of species, which of course means nothing to the whooping crane or whatever that you're trying to make this sort of ambassador of preventing extinction. We sort of recruited them into these roles where they have to be, forcibly inseminated in some cases and taught by humans how to migrate, how to figure out how to fly, and do all of these things that humans take over these roles. And the amount of just bodily manipulation and suffering that these animals are sometimes subjected to for a cause that I think most of us consider to be worthy, right? We do want to prevent extinction. If there's any chance of these ones that are right on the brink of extinction, we should do everything we can to save them. But looking at it from the animal's perspective, it's really very disturbing to, what Tom Van Doren does in particular, sort of what people call like field philosophy or kind of multi-species ethnography of working with people who work with these animals and sort of seeing what they go through. And he doesn't say that that's, therefore we shouldn't do this, but he just raises a lot of really interesting and troubling questions about how we intervene in the lives of these animals for the sake of something that really is kind of more about us than it is, about them.
Right. So at the extreme, having a pair of Siberian tigers in a zoo, is that even preventing extinction? I mean, you have the line, but
well, I mean, a lot of people say if people just get to see these animals and see how magnificent they are, this will, this is the sort of good news story that people want to hear. But one of the examples of an attempt to de-extinct an animal is this, this sort of elephant mammoth hybrid that would be created, which involves, I mean, just the sheer amount of money and technology and time that goes into this. If that could be used in some better way to educate people about extinction. I mean, the main causes of extinction are things like habitat loss, because humans, are reclaiming lands from animals. So even if you can bring them back, there are still people who don't want them. That's why they went extinct in the first place. And you can't, there's just no reason to assume you can reintroduce, especially some de-extincted animal, and everything's going to be fine. So there's just a real avoidance of the underlying causes of extinction, and also just what the animals themselves go through in these, these high-tech, very manipulative sort of procedures.
Wow. Thank you very much, Lisa. It was really great talking to you. I think I'll turn things over to Greg Johnson.
Thank you, Greg Jarrett. I appreciate it very much. And thank you to your students as well for joining us and asking some good questions. We have some rich questions here. So Professor Sideris, if you are amenable to it, let's turn over to the Q&A for a bit. Well, we have just a range of fabulous questions, but let's start in fairness to those posted first. Claudia asks, how do you teach a course on extinction without sinking into depression, both you and your students? I teach a course on conservation and have similar challenges. How to teach and discuss these topics that are truly grief-inducing, but still encourage your students to have hope? You've talked around this a bit, but do you wish to reply to Claudia?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't have a formula for this, but I think that one of the ways that I handle it is just to address it very upfront, and to talk about how this material makes us feel, encourage students to sort of write about how they're feeling about what they're reading, to acknowledge that that there's real moral value in witnessing. I think is a nice framing of what we're doing is witnessing, and witnessing is a powerful thing. So I think just acknowledging that these are all, that we all feel this, and that this is a normal response to some of this material. But there's also a lot, I think, that I try to include in the class that is a way of showing the way that animals and humans participate together in a kind of multi-species community. And so, the flip side of some of that kind of multi-species ethnography or field work with conservation is this learning how much, my dog is coming over here as I'm saying this, so she's making a whimpering noise. It's learning how much, animals themselves live in their own worlds and have these really fascinating communities.
Yeah.
And that humans and animals evolved in all of these ways that are just fascinating to learn about. So I think there's a lot of just fun stuff in there too, that I try to not make it all about extinction as this unraveling of the world, but also just to think about theoretical questions of like, what is extinction exactly? Which is, it's the death of a species, or what does that mean? That species are kind of an abstract concept. It's not something you can see and feel and encounter. And there's something about that conversation about what extinction even is, or what a species is, or what it means for a species to die, that I think just leads itself to religious questions, really. Those are religious kinds of questions, just to wrap our heads around what it means for a species to die.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. Thank you. Turning to John's question, Wendell Berry observed that while climate change manifests throughout the atmosphere, its causes are the myriad instances of local waste pollution for which local solutions must be found if the climate crisis is to be avoided. So that's more of a comment, and it's not so different than a question that Greg asked you, but do you wish to elaborate on that any further?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's true. I think that you know, all global problems have local manifestations, and that people actually can only relate to them for the most part on the local level. I mean, we can absorb lots of information about something that's a global problem, but you know, I mean, in some ways, I think so that tension between the local and the global is something that inadvertently, I think some climate scientists themselves kind of perpetuated, that disconnect, because, you know, for so long we were told that, you know, any given weather event can't be considered an instance of climate change, for example. There's weather is different from climate. You know, and it's a way, it's kind of like telling people to ignore their senses. You know, people can actually experience climate change, and especially people who have been in a place for a long time. You know, you talk to farmers, lots of people who work with the land or who've just lived in one place for a long time. They can tell you that they're seeing climate change. And so to be told that what you're experiencing is not really what you're experiencing, I think was not a very helpful way initially for climate science to talk about that. And I think they're beginning to change that tactic a little bit, to recognize that people have on the ground sensory perceptions of climate change manifest through weather and other kinds of changes in the landscape. And, you know, those things matter to people. You know, it's not about I believe or don't believe in climate change. If you talk to people in many places, they'll tell you the differences that they're seeing in their landscape. And I think that's a place to start, because people can't really connect to the globe as a whole. They can connect to particular places.
No, that sounds right. Yeah, thanks for that elaboration. Absolutely. So Nico asks a really big question, eager for your answer. How do you see the role of myth making in creating a positive climate future? And of course, as scholars of religion, we think a good deal about myth making. And Roland Barthes, of course, was famous for stipulating that in the modern era, 20th and presumably 21st century, that myth making was largely hegemonic and from the right, and that the left has failed and will continue to fail to weave compelling myths. So how do you see it? Is there a role of myth making in creating a positive climate future?
And really, that is exactly the question that I'm trying to answer in my own work. And I don't think I'm quite there yet, but you know, a lot of what I've been concerned about in my work, and myth comes up again and again in things that I write about, is the kind of the misuse of myth, the sort of, you know, use of misconstrual of certain myths, as I said earlier, sort of not as cautionary tales or warnings, but as a sort of like a goad or a sort of legitimation of certain types of behavior, like to transgress, to press against those limits. And, you know, if you look at the context of a lot of myths that get used in this very selective and kind of superficial way, I mean, I'm thinking of, for example, the story of Lazarus that's often pinned to de-extinction initiatives like the Lazarus Project, right? Well, I mean, you know, it's a complicated story. And if you go look at it, it's a lot more complicated than raising people from the dead or organisms from the dead is a good thing. There's some really dark and ambiguous stuff in that story. So some of it is just the way that myths have been flattened out. Some of it is that the way that they are so top down in some environmental religion and ecology work that I've been critical of, that, you know, there's one story and everyone has to sort of plug into it. And it's the story of the universe, and you can find yourself in this grand narrative. And I just wonder how that really motivates people. For one thing, they have to kind of give up their own stories to some extent, or find some way fitting them into a story that seems, it's presented as though it's a true myth. That is, it's sort of selectively taking bits of science and weaving them into a narrative and saying, unlike those myths that you have, this one's true, and that's why you should adopt it. And that's just a very strange distortion, I think, of what myths do. But one hopeful thing that I've seen, I'm thinking of a researcher whose work that I read recently. His name is Timothy Stacy, and he and I had a dialogue about this on the Religious Studies Project website. So what he's doing, he's working with environmental activists, and he's looking at the stories they tell about how they got involved as activists. And so these are much more like organic, kind of personal stories. You know, if you ask someone,
Your volume's going out, just so you know, if you lean forward, there you go. Okay, sorry. No, now it's gone, sorry. It's gone. Oh, I shouldn't have asked to fix what maybe wasn't broken. There you are. Try that. No. Well, now I'm hoping it's not on my side. Okay, keep trying. Well, Alma or Amber, could you tell me if you're hearing?
I am not.
You are not. Thank you. Okay, so the problem's evidently on your end. Why don't you just fuss with it for a second, and if we're not able to get you back, then we've certainly had a good conversation, but we won't grieve yet. We'll remain hopeful and be wondrous about your abilities to bring your sound back.
how's that?
Hey, there we are. Great.
Honestly, I've had so much trouble with this laptop, which is brand new. So it's my technology hates me because I'm always criticizing technology. So
There you go.
if I can finish answering this question.
Please.
Yeah. So one of the things this researcher does, Timothy Stacy is his name, is he asks activists, why do you do what you do? And then they tell a story, and the story is often draws on fictional characters or movies. Just like, you know, there's something that, you know, inspires people in imaginary worlds, even if they're not religious per se, they are very religious-like. You know, someone will tell a story from The Hobbit, or think of themselves as a character in a book, and he says, you know, if you were to say to people, do you believe this character is real? They would say, well, no, of course not. But the way that religion scholars sometimes talk to people, you know, or this whole obsession with what's real and true, is kind of missing the whole point of how people's imaginary worlds actually work. And so that kind of myth making that people do all the time, when they tell you sort of why they do what they do, you know, where they came from, why they value the things they value, I think that's a maybe potent kind of myth making that activists tell, and then they share those stories, and it becomes part of their mythology as a group, as activists.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That rings true in my experience for sure. Thanks for pointing that out. Well, good. Let's move on to Shakir's question. He says, thank you for your discussion of wonder, Dr. Sideris. I'm wondering, in quotations, about the distinction between wonder and suspicion. Your work differentiates between appropriate and inappropriate forms of wonder. Do you think that there is a qualitative difference between suspicion and wonder?
Not sure how suspicion works in this category. I mean, I guess one of the distinctions that I often make is between wonder and curiosity, where curiosity is more of the desire, like a puzzle solving kind of desire, you know, to eradicate the sense of wonder by finding, you know, the solution. Whereas wonder is something, so puzzle solving is something that people do for fun, right? You can do it in serial fashion, puzzle is an interesting thing and then you solve it. That's the whole point. Wonder is something that, at least ideally, kind of remains open. It never is completely extinguished or eradicated, because it's not what it goes after, I think, is not an answer, or an explanation, but it's really more about a kind of experience or a kind of orientation on the world. So I'm not sure if I'm addressing the suspicion part, because I'm not sure what.
Yeah. No, this is helpful. And I think actually the next question from Charles is a nice follow-on to some of what you're saying here. So maybe let's just continue on and see if that helps clarify a response to Shakir's question. Charles says, in your comments about wonder, you seem to make a distinction between science and nature while associating wonder uniquely with nature. Is that your intent? As a scientist, I can assure what we observe, see, and learn is full of wonder. While wonder may not be integral to a physical telescope, I'd argue that, there's certainly wonder in what one sees through the instrument. Surely. So again, nuancing the questions around wonder and how we inflect it and to whose purposes is it put and so forth. And in what ways does it deflect attention or draw attention? This kind of bundle of issues is, you've touched a nerve with your meditations on wonder. I love it.
Yeah, and I think it's really possible to overstate this kind of distinction between wonder generated by science and wonder generated by nature. How do we even know what nature is without, scientific study? But what I'm talking about is something that happens in certain popularizers of science that I read and write about, or sort of science communicators, where the idea is really that when you wonder at something in the natural world, you aren't experiencing true wonder unless you understand how it works. Unless you have the scientific explanation of it, then your wonder is a kind of muddled mysticism or something. And this is particularly true, I think, of people like Richard Dawkins, who's written quite a bit about wonder. Mm-hmm. And I want to push back against that, because people have experiences of nature, especially direct kind of encounters with nature, where the scientific account really doesn't play a role in it at all, and it need not play a role in it. On the other hand, there are times many times, I think, when science is a kind of a lens on the wonders of nature, things that we would not possibly know if we didn't have the tools of science, and sometimes literally tools like a telescope, something that you can, or a microscope, things that you can see that the human eye cannot see. So it's not that science can't produce wonder. I just don't think it's an ultimate object of wonder in itself. I think it's a way of appreciating wonder. It can open up a world of wonder. But when it becomes something like just a litany of all that we know, which it often is in certain science writers, then I think it begins to displace nature as an object of wonder, because it suggests that if you're not sort of experiencing wonder of nature through science, you're not really experiencing wonder, which also just cuts many of us off from the possibility of experiencing real wonder. It's like, if you're not a scientist, it's like a priesthood where people reveal the world to you and tell you what to wonder at. So there's something very authoritarian about that move as well, I think.
No, that's helpful. And I think also if we historicize discourses of wonder, we see how quickly they're followed by discourses of possession. And I think anyone who's been on the wrong side of settler colonialism because of the beauty of their lands or the shape of their women or whatever you might have could tell many stories, as Stephen Greenblatt and others have, about discourses of wonder and their dark side. Juan asks, we'll call him Troublesome Juan. He says, although you are new here, I am sure you have heard about the Munger Residence Hall proposed for our campus. I would be interested in how you think of this as a reference point for our place in the Anthropocene and how to respond to it.
Well, of course, I don't know the history of it. From what I understand, it's been going on for a while, debates about the structure. I'm afraid that in some ways it does seem to me to be exactly the kind of artificial human as maker sort of world that people like Rachel Carson worried about, that, she has this beautiful line that sort of, the more we go into the artificial worlds of our own making, the kind of less humane we become in some ways. And although I think some of the accounts of this building, from what I know, have been a little bit exaggerated in terms of just how reckless the design might be. It does seem to me that it's an odd thing for this campus to have embraced, because there's such a history of sustainable design, in this university. And it's out of place in so many ways. It's out of place because, of course, it has no place in the natural environment, which cannot be viewed from many of the rooms in this building. But it also just seems to be breaking with a tradition at UCSB, which is one that I very much admire, of eco-design, right? And when you think about what eco-design is supposed to be, and this came up in one of our conversations the other night, I think that a big component of that is not just like energy efficiency or, using as little energy as possible or making the most of this or that. It also has a very significant psychological component and how people respond to their physical environments. And so much of that seems to have been neglected in the structure. I don't know how that can qualify as a kind of sustainable design when human psychology is, well, if anything, is endangered perhaps by this particular design, at least from what I understand about it. So, yeah. It's a techno wonder for sure.
Yeah. Right. That much we can say in your framework that requires a fair bit of techno optimism, one might say. No, thank you. Well, let's just take two more, and then and we'll thank you for such a wonderful night. So a short one. Natalie asks, are there any unethical methods of sustainability you believe are popular at the moment? Maybe misguided ecological efforts, for example.
Well, I mean, certainly the whole story of recycling is pretty disastrous. I think we've all been sort of duped about what's actually happening to many of the things that we thought we were recycling. A lot of them being shipped, yes, far away and then sort of brought back to us as cheap goods. So that's one example that comes to mind. I mean, there's all kinds of greenwashing that goes on, yeah, from the corporate level on down to products. This is actually, for the person who asked this question, I think Sarah McFarlane Taylor's book about eco-piety does a really good job of talking about that. The way that, environmentalism is being marketed to us with all these green products, that, people can spend ridiculous amounts of money on something that, is supposed to be making their day-to-day life much greener. And, that's just become its own kind of form of capitalism to market those things to us. So, yeah, so I think we have to be, some things are definitely improvements, but it's also just a kind of media trend that we should be suspicious of.
No, well said. Thank you.
If you want to put that book in the chat as well. Sarah's work. I think she spoke.
Yeah, so she gave a talk for us. There's a video on our website about it. It was about 2 years ago. She was a student of Wade Clark Roof, who was the former director of the CAP Center, and someone the department certainly celebrates. So yeah, Alma, if you could find the book from Sarah McFarlane Taylor on eco-piety, if you could Google that up and post it in the link, that would be awesome. Thank you. Well, do you have energy for one more question? Okay, well, we've got about 10 minutes top. So why don't we take one more? We'll acknowledge that Charles has chimed back in to really emphasize that science is an exercise in wonder. And Charles, we admire your endurance and persistence and your wonder. And okay, I'm persuaded,
Oh,
depending on just what we mean.
I would just say read my book because it's a lot more nuanced, I think, on this.
Well, let's get you and Charles together. He's a local friend, so let's have lunch. Charles, we'll get you offline and we'll do that and sort this out. Anonymous attendee asks or says, Andrew Feenberg suggests that technology can be both medicinal or poisonous depending on its use. Others have pointed out that capitalist forces are more to blame for the adverse effects of technology as opposed to the technology itself, or the wonder of techno-optimism that creates it. In view of this, the term Capitalocene has been proposed as a corrective to Anthropocene. How would you respond to this view of the problem?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I mean, I think there's, and the Capitalocene way of framing it as well, I think is very helpful. But in particular, this idea that technology, it's not quite that technology is neutral. I wouldn't know if I would say that exactly, but I think that a lot of people on the left, a lot of environmentalists have been unduly suspicious of technology when they ought to have been more suspicious of capitalism, actually.
Yeah.
And particularly suspicious of the possibility that there could be any kind of large scale, like industrial technology that could also be put to good use. And I'm really borrowing a lot of this from a book by Holly Jean Buck that's about geoengineering. It's called After Geoengineering. And she makes a very compelling case in that book that it is possible to envision uses of geoengineering technology that are consistent with the goals of environmental justice advocates, which was a hard sell to me. And I think she makes a pretty compelling case. And she speaks of technology. It's not a thing, she says, it's a practice. And I find, although she doesn't dwell on it a lot, I find this concept of technology as a practice to be much more interesting, thinking about the way that it's integrated into other kinds of things that we do and why we do them, even to sort of integrate something like certain types of geoengineering into a kind of Green New Deal. Because all these other things that we have to do, like carbon removal and different kinds of farming techniques and dealing with all the carbon that's in the oceans, and all of these things have to go together, and the political system has to also shift if geoengineering is going to be anything but another kind of disaster capitalism. So yeah, I think that is really important. And environmentalists, I'm one of them, in this mode tend to be very skeptical, suspicious of large scale technology, and I think that's something that some of us should reconsider.
Wow, interesting. No, thank you for that. Well, I said that would be the last question, but I want to offer you the last word. Is there anything else you'd like to say by way of rounding out the conversation?
Well, just thanks everyone for the great questions. If there's anything that I didn't address very adequately or didn't address at all because we didn't have time, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to continue this conversation with people who agree and disagree with me either way. So thank you all for the question.
And thank you. What a great event. It was so great to hear from you, so timely, so urgent, and also so wonderful to know we don't need to say goodbye because alas, you'll be on campus with us and a regular, we hope, in our own building even. I want to thank the audience again for coming and staying with us. I trust you learned as much as I did, and Professor Sideris, we'll see you again soon, I hope. Okay, good night, everybody. Okay, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks.